married, and, as Carolyn Rome, she moved to Darmstadt, Germany, to lead the life of a wealthy, lonely hausfrau. After a year of domestic boredom, Rome ran back to De Laurenta in tears, the marriage a failure. De Laurenta gave her responsibility for his lower-priced Miss O line, and the traumatized young divorcee threw herself into the work with a vengeance. A year later, in 1979, she met Kravis at a party. It wasn't love at first sight. Kravis was too short, for one thing, and he had a boring job on Wall Street. He was also married, although separated from his wife of 9 years. After a Christmas-time skiing date in Vail, Rome's mother chaperoned, they began seeing each other. Theirs was not a storybook love affair. Rome, coming off a tough divorce, was a reluctant target. It was a friendship, Rome recalled. Being together with Henry was like putting a wonderful salve on a bad wound. My recollection is not clouded by the romance of the beginning, because there wasn't one. We were friends for a long time before I thought of him as a lover. Kravis's marriage had been on the wane for years. In 1970, he had wed Hedy Schulman, the daughter of a Brooklyn psychiatrist. The Kravises, with a Park Avenue apartment and rented summer homes in Greenwich or the Hamptons, had always been social climbers. But by most accounts, Kravis, his later riches still a dream, balked at his wife's spending habits. Hedy always wanted to buy the biggest and the best, the most, recalled a family friend. Henry didn't like to spend money at that time. Hedy was driven by the dollar. It drove Henry crazy. It was personally embarrassing to him to have to explain to people out in North Carolina why his wife was going off to a summer home with their staff. One summer evening, Kravis stepped off the train in Greenwich to find Hedy waiting expectantly. "Henry, I found the most wonderful house to buy," she enthused. She drove Kravis out a lonely road where mansions lay a mile apart. Down a long, wooded lane she led him, emerging before a virtual castle. Kravis, unnerved, didn't even want to get out of the car. Kravis attacked the courtship of Rome with all the zest of a major takeover contest. On their way to a formal dinner one night, he insisted she test a pair of new tennis shoes. He despised the ratty old sneakers she had worn for years. Rome, trying her damnedest to slip into her red lace dress, finally relented and took a shoe. In its toe, she found a diamond necklace. "As far as romance goes, Henry has fantasy," Rome says. "It's not Oscar Wilde, but of all the business types I've gone out with, he's by far the most romantic. Every anniversary, every Christmas, every birthday, he writes me these sweet, long letters about what he's feeling. You know, my faith, my love, my belief in you. They're very touching letters. I've kept all of them." They were partners in business before marriage. In 1984, Kravis agreed to invest several $1 million to bankroll Rome in her own design business. She rented half a floor in the 7th Avenue building that also housed Lauren, Bean, and Blass. Unveiled in a show 7 months later, Rome's first collection of elegant evening wear and sprightly day wear was a triumph. When she strolled out for the standing ovation, a teary Rome waved to the man who made it possible, Henry Kravis. He was crying too. Rome was ready for marriage, but Kravis, after finally getting a divorce in 1984, apparently was having second thoughts. One day, as she frantically prepared for her first showing, Rome broke down in tears before her mentor. "I don't think Henry will marry me," she said. De Laurenta, ever the father figure, called Kravis. "You're going to tell me this is none of my business, and it is none of my business," the designer said. "I understand that you've had a bad divorce and may not be in the mood to marry again. But I've got to tell you, I will be very disturbed if Carolyn becomes the mistress of an unmarried man. I think she's better than that. I will use all my influence to break the relationship." When Kravis finally asked for her hand, Rome wavered. They were in Italy, where Rome was shopping for new fabrics for her next collection. "I said I had to think about it," she recalled. Crestfallen, Kravis pestered her about it all evening and into the next day. He kept saying, "I can't believe you said that, I can't believe it." Every 5 minutes it was, "What's your decision?" He kept at me all the next day until Finally, around 3, I said, "Well, okay." Days before their wedding, the couple moved into an apartment whose elaborate furnishings immediately became the talk of the town. English and French antiques from Louis XV to Empire filled the public rooms, where rich silken draperies fell in puddles onto the floor. On the living room's celadon walls hung a Renoir, across from a Monet landscape. In his library, Kravis preferred English horse paintings. A drawing room held a Sisley, a second Renoir, and Dutch flower paintings. The apricot and yellow damask dining room, with its massive sergeant, conjured up visions of a grand English manor house. Coral damask lined the walls, and silk festoon shades adorned the windows. To one side was a faux marbre dining alcove, where Rome would place a trio, 2 violinists and, say, a harpist, to play softly for dinner guests. 4 years later, GQ would enshrine the Kravis-Rome wedding, along with that of Charles and Diana, as one of the 20 weddings of the century since 1980. Their vows, exchanged at the apartment, were followed by dinner for 101 and a toast by Kravis's father. "Henry's always been impatient," said Ray Kravis. "He was born premature, and he's been in a hurry ever since." The newlyweds cut a wide swath through Manhattan society. Kravis, already on many of the right boards, New York City Ballet, Mount Sinai Hospital, the exclusive Spence School, leapt onto the coveted Metropolitan Museum Board and had a museum wing named after him. Rome, whose dresses cost up to $8,000 and are worn by the likes of Barbara Walters and Sigourney Weaver, attained the New York Public Library Board of Trustees and orchestrated memorable galas for the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Winter Antiques Show. The Kravises added a beach home in the Hamptons, a ski chalet in Vail, and a pre-revolutionary manor in Connecticut, where Rome gardened and rode horses, and Kravis sometimes raced around on a Honda four-wheeler. Despite his burgeoning fortune, variously estimated at between $200 million and $350 million, the Kravises continued to work grueling 12-hour days, traveling constantly. When in New York, they went out nightly, becoming mainstays of W and Women's Wear Daily, in large part because Rome, threatened by up-and-coming designers like Donna Karan, made a conscious decision to seek the social limelight. Her clothes were intended for women like herself, tall, thin, and rich, and she saw the society pages as her best bet to stand out in a crowded field. W noted wryly that in her quest for publicity, Rome appeared on the cover of every imaginable publication, including real estate listings. It wondered, is Pravda next? In many ways, it was a storybook life. Summers in Salzburg, holidays in Vail, weekends hunting pheasant in Connecticut, evenings at glittering charity balls, mornings with Rome strolling through the Renoirs, an aria on her lips. Their West Highland terrier, Pookie, walked each day by a liveried servant. Of all the stories, the one told most often was of the night Kravis surprised his wife in bed with an eye-popping emerald necklace. When she wore it to a council of fashion designers' cocktail party, it was the talk of the crowd. "Where did you get those?" asked a longtime friend. "I found them under my pillow," Rome replied. "And where have you been sleeping?" "In the right bed." By 1987, the LBO industry, once the exclusive hunting ground of Kohlberg Kravis and a handful of other boutique firms, was getting crowded. Attracted by the tremendous returns seen in Gibson Greetings and Beatrice, institutional investors poured billions of dollars into scores of firms, hoping to get a piece of Kravis's action. Two of Wall Street's largest concerns, Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch, each raised more than $1 billion to do LBOs, and most other firms, including Shearson, planned similar thrusts. Kravis and Roberts hadn't even finished spending their $2 billion 1986 fund, by far Wall Street's largest, before one of their rivals, Forstmann Little and Company, unveiled a $2.7 billion fund. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps Kravis had been hearing became a thundering posse, charging into his corral. Now deals where Kravis could once have quietly negotiated a buyout agreement became bidding contests. Done deals unraveled in the face of higher bids, sometimes wasting months of work. When Kravis did carry the day, prices were sky high. "A lot of guys want to do deals just to do them," complained Paul Rather. "They want to put scalps up on their walls. They say, 'I gotta do this deal because it'll make me a player, it'll put me on the map.'" For Kravis, a startling case in point came during the fall 1986 bidding contest for Jim Walter, a Tampa construction firm. A Kohlberg-Kravis bid was topped by Payne Weber, a firm with no track record in LBOs. When Kravis, alarmed, asked the firm's chairman, Donald Marin, what he thought he was doing, Marin pointed out that his firm had a lot of money and talent committed to merchant banking and needed to put them to use. It wouldn't be the last such conversation Kravis had. If Kohlberg-Kravis were to reassert its dominance in LBOs, it somehow had to rise above the competition. The only place to go was up. In early 1987, Kravis and Roberts made a conscious decision to go after the mega deals, the $5 billion and $10 billion buyouts that few others could attempt. They had laid the groundwork by completing a string of mammoth LBOs, the $6.2 billion Beatrice deal, the $4.4 billion buyout of Safeway stores, and the $2.1 billion buyout of Owens, Illinois in 1987. Now they would push into higher, uncharted territories. Who else could do a $10 billion deal, was the reasoning, recalled Rather. Nobody. The only possible competitor at those levels was corporations, and most likely you won't get competition from corporations at that price level. Erasing the competition wasn't the only attraction of the megadeal. Kravis and Roberts knew from experience that it took little more work to complete a large LBO than it did a small one. Whatever the size of the transaction, however, their percentile fees remained the same. It didn't take a genius to see they could make more money working on $10 billion deals than puny $100 million deals. On Beatrice, they had taken a $45 million fee, plus $60 million apiece on Safeway and Owens, Illinois. That money went straight into the partners' pockets. The vehicle to attain these new heights was a new fund, their largest ever. Even before spending the 1986 fund, Roberts began lobbying to raise another, bigger one. "We don't have to finish the 1986 fund," he argued. "The money is available now. Let's get it while we can." Recalled Rather, "By 1987, everyone had a pot of money. We wanted to have by far the biggest pot. That would differentiate us from everybody else. It would be clear we had more power than anyone else, and everyone would know it. Everyone would know the big deals were ours." They began raising the new fund in June 1987, using publicity from the Beatrice deal to whip up interest. As an incentive to investors to re-up, Kravis offered to waive the management fee for all deals done before 1990. It worked. When the fund closed just 4 months later, Kravis and Roberts sat atop a $5.6 billion war chest, more than 2 times the size of its nearest competitors. Of the estimated $20 billion in equity poised for LBO investments worldwide, the 2 grandsons of a Russian immigrant controlled $1 of every 4. Fully leveraged, it gave them an unprecedented $45 billion in buying power. Enough money, Fortune pointed out, to buy all 10 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in Minneapolis, including Honeywell, General Mills, and Pillsbury. Wall Street had never seen anything like it before. Wall Street didn't know the half of it. For the first time, Kravis and Roberts had sought and received permission from their investors to secretly accumulate stock in their targets. These so-called toehold investments, a mainstay of corporate raiders like Boone Pickens, would give Kravis negotiating advantage with chief executives and allow the firm to profit from the inevitable run-up in a target company's stock. A reaction to its new competitive environment, this tactic, more than any other, took the firm away from Jerry Kohlberg's fireside chats and institutionalized its new, more aggressive bent. Arm-twisting, rather than friendly discussion, would now lead to most of the firm's deals. But this approach required Kravis to walk a fine line. Most pension funds, the major source of Kohlberg-Kravis's money, were either barred from or leery of hostile takeovers. Just a whiff of hostile action could scare off investors and irreparably damage their franchise in strictly friendly LBOs. If Kohlberg-Kravis were branded a raider, what chief executive in his right mind would want to work with it? It made Kravis, thin-skinned by nature, acutely sensitive to public criticism. As stock prices plummeted in the crash of October 1987, Kravis and Roberts made their move, swooping in and secretly buying vast chunks of several major U.S. corporations. In 1988, they brought the LBO idea to one of those companies, its identity still secret, and were rejected. At the end of March, Kravis unveiled a 4.9% stake in Texaco, then under pressure from its largest shareholder, investor Carl Icahn. For 2 months, Kravis and Roberts attempted to talk the oil company's officials into a buyout or major restructuring. "We tried everything in the world to get them to do something with us," Rather recalled, "and they wouldn't." The firm eventually sold its stock at a profit. The problem, it soon became clear, was that Kohlberg-Kravis was all bite and no bark. With one eye trained on their pension fund investors, Kravis and Roberts couldn't bring themselves to make an outright hostile bid, and everyone knew it. In mid-September, the firm made an unsolicited $4.64 billion bid to acquire Kroger, the Cincinnati-based grocery chain that had days before rejected a similar offer from the Haft family. Kroger twice rejected Kravis's overtures, leaving him with a nice profit on his 9.9% stock position and egg on his face. It wasn't just new deals that were turning sour. After shedding many of its businesses, Kravis was finding it impossible to sell the remainder of Beatrice. The problem was a nasty knot of liabilities that no buyer wanted to take on. After being perused by every food industry buyer from Ross Johnson to Heinz, Beatrice, for the moment, belonged to Kravis. By mid-year, not only hadn't the $3 billion profit they had hoped for materialized, Kravis and his investors were little better than break-even. It had been a rotten year. Rejected by his targets, competitors nipping at his heels, Kravis couldn't be blamed for falling into a foul mood. When Jeff Beck mentioned approaching RJR Nabisco, Kravis hadn't thought much of it. Kravis sent out dozens of similar feelers every month. On October 5th, Kravis breakfasted with one of his favorite investment bankers, Steve Waters of Morgan Stanley. "What's going on with RJR?" Kravis asked. He hadn't talked with Johnson since their meeting a year before. Waters said he knew of nothing new. The last time the two had discussed RJR Nabisco, Kravis had been worried about the tobacco industry's mounting legal problems. After the Chipolone case, his worries had subsided. "I've rethought some of my objections about tobacco liability," he told Waters. "Maybe we should see if Ross might want to talk." Waters telephoned Johnson later that day. Jim Welch returned his call. "Henry has changed his mind about tobacco liability, Jim," Waters said. "He'd really like to sit down with you guys." "Well, that's interesting," Welch replied. "Ross is busy now. Let us think about it. We'll crank through the numbers and get back to you." Waters' call should have been a warning. Johnson ignored it. Chapter 6. The history of merchant banking, with the exception of RJR Nabisco, is that I stayed out of it. Peter A. Cohen. As his sleek Gulfstream jet descended through the clouds over Atlanta that Friday evening, Peter Cohen pondered the weekend ahead. The following morning, October 8th, Cohen was to meet with Ross Johnson for the first time in nearly a month. Tom Hill's team had been assembling data for weeks, although Johnson still hadn't signaled whether he would go through with an LBO. Cohen hoped they would find out in the morning. It had been a long flight from Zurich, where Cohen had ended a 2-week European business and pleasure trip, and he was tired. Cohen was a short man, his skull gripped by a tight cap of brown hair. He liked to joke about writers' descriptions of him. Always small, dark, and, a real favorite, intense. Institutional Investor once compared his looks to those of Al Pacino as Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 2. Cohen looked like a tough guy, and for years, that's pretty much what he was. As a longtime aide to one of Shearson's founders, Sandy Weil, he had earned a reputation as a hatchet man. If he were an animal, Cohen would be a wolverine. Turning 40 and taking the reins at Shearson had mellowed him, or so it seemed. Friends talked of how much Cohen had grown in recent years, meaning he no longer referred to a tiny competitor like Dylan Reed as a peanut, as he had in one published interview. Nor did he publicly label critics assholes, as he once had. At the urging of Jim Robinson, his boss at American Express, Cohen had taken strides to become more statesmanlike, making the rounds in Washington, talking loftily of the globalization of the securities industry, and nurturing friendships with heavy hitters like European industrialist Carlo Di Benedetti. He had taken pains to hone his sharp edges. Gone from his office was the sculpted chainsaw and the statue of two pinstriped legs cut off at the calves. In their place were family pictures and his children's finger paintings. Years before it became faddish, Cohen was making an effort to present a kinder, gentler image. The son of a clothing manufacturer, Cohen grew up on Long Island and attended public schools and Ohio State University. As a teenager, he loved poring through the Fortunes and Dunn's Reviews to which his father subscribed. The elder Cohen bought his son T. Rowe Price mutual funds, and Cohen had been fascinated by the stock market ever since. He worked odd jobs through high school, and at Ohio State made a small fortune brokering kegs of Colt 45 beer to the fraternities. If hustling came naturally to Cohen, school didn't. As a finance major, he was a solid C student. At Columbia Business School, Cohen haunted the Midtown brokerage offices, watching the market and investing the proceeds from his beer brokering days. He canceled plans to enter the family business when his father wouldn't pay him what Cohen thought he was worth. Instead, he headed to Wall Street. Cohen had married young, at 22, and by his late 20s had 2 children. As Wild's assistant, he was the one who stayed late, his office light burning deep into the night. He was an administrator, never a trader or an investment banker. In tough negotiations, it was Cohen who played the bad cop. He was good with threats. He had no time to learn about wine, art, travel, and the other fine things Wall Street executives seemed bred for. For years, he traveled the world's great cities, ignorant of all but their airports. Now, when in Rome or Madrid, Cohen tried to take half a day to take in the things he had missed. At 40, he discovered the Louvre, the Musée d'Orsay, the National Museum in Taipei. He improved his tennis and golf games. Friends thought Cohen worked very hard to learn how to relax. In the early 1980s, Shearson, the successor to a long line of smaller houses, had been a scrappy, fast-growing wirehouse. That is, it made its money handling transactions for individual investors by wire. It had no investment banking arm to speak of. But just a year after taking over from Weil in 1983, Cohen stunned Wall Street by buying its oldest partnership, Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb, a top-flight, blue-blooded investment bank that had all but disintegrated after a civil war among its quarreling partners. It was a strange marriage. Lehman was sterling silver cigarette boxes, fresh flowers, impressionist paintings, and dusty bottles of Petrus and Haut-Brion in the wine cellar. Shearson was empty pizza boxes, half-empty cartons of Chinese noodles, and coffee in a styrofoam cup. Shearson taking over Lehman, an old Lehman partisan quipped, is like McDonald's taking over 21. Much like its chairman, the combined firm of Shearson-Lehman came to be marked by a peculiar blend of elegance and streetwise chutzpah, brass knuckles in a velvet glove. Amid the cultured quiet of its 19th-floor executive offices, tastefully decorated with Audubon prints and oriental rugs, visitors were greeted by a gentleman named Gus, who, while leafing through the New York Daily News, gave directions in a thick New York accent. "Go through those double doors," he would say. Backed by the tremendous firepower of American Express, which had acquired majority control of Shearson in 1981, Cohen had looked for ways to put his firm's capital to work for years. By the mid-1980s, competitors such as Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch were thrusting into LBOs and, in efforts to compete with Drexel's junk bond capabilities, had begun lending their own money in interim takeover financings known as bridge loans. These loans were typically refinanced or bridged by the later sale of junk bonds. The trend was collectively known as merchant banking, a highfalutin term that basically meant investment banks were putting their money where their mouths had been for years. Shearson's entry into merchant banking had been both late and lackluster. Lehman's active takeover business gave Cohen access for the first time to a wealth of investment opportunities. But for all its eagerness, Shearson backed into the LBO business. After the Lehman merger, a number of senior Lehman partners jumped to other firms, and Cohen was determined not to lose any more. In late 1984, he flew to England with a proposition for the chief of Lehman's London office, Stephen W. Burchard. His idea was intriguing. Would Burchard come back to New York and devise a means to generate profits to line top executives' pockets? The idea was, let's get these guys richer, Burchard recalled. Just make money however you can. Burchard came up with an answer: LBOs. But after a number of false starts, he managed only one buyout of any size, and that proved a nightmare. 6 months after the $482 million buyout of Scheller Globe, a Toledo-based auto parts maker, news accounts reported that Cohen and 14 Shearson executives had been slapped with subpoenas as part of an insider trading probe by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Cohen denied any wrongdoing, and an investigation never turned up any, but it was a mortifying experience. The deal that's dragging Shearson into the spotlight, Businessweek called it. It was a tough introduction to LBOs. Cohen had never really been around corporate finance, recalled Burchard, who resigned after a tiff with Cohen during Scheller Globe. Peter knew what he read in the magazines, but he had about as much experience in investment banking as my father, who had advised Burchard to stay away from Wall Street. Burchard's replacement, hired in June 1986, was a controversial figure named Daniel Good, who, as merger chief at E.F. Hutton, had built a thriving business backing corporate raiders. Good, so boundlessly optimistic he was sometimes called Dan Quixote, didn't back four-star investors like Carl Icahn or Boone Pickens. His clients were little-known wannabe raiders, third-tier greenmailers such as Asher Edelman, a Fifth Avenue arbitrager, and Herbert Haft, the pompadoured scourge of the retail industry. Instead of LBOs, Cohen chose to funnel Shearson's money into bridge loans for Good's raiders. With a wink and a shrug, they could call this merchant banking, but for the most part, Good's clients were interested only in hounding corporate America's sick and wounded until they either bought back their shares or sought a merger elsewhere. Either way, Shearson profited. A number of Shearson executives were violently opposed to Good's hiring, especially the M&A team, Hill and Waters, who considered Good a glorified shakedown artist. Good's raider clients, Hill argued, would stain Shearson's reputation and prevent it from establishing contacts with the blue-chip corporate giants it needed to build its traditional merger advisory business. Hill campaigned tirelessly against Good, a crusade that didn't stop even when he joined the firm. He and Waters took to keeping a list of Good's mistakes. Hill, said a colleague, was out to cut off Dan's balls from the beginning. But after Good's first deal, Paul Bilzerian's 1986 raid on Hammermill Paper produced a fat $6 million fee, Cohen's doubts vanished. It was the easiest money Shearson had ever made. "Jesus," enthused George Scheinberg, a Shearson vice chairman. "This is great." For 15 months, Good's clients kept fees pouring into Cohen's coffers as Shearson backed raids on several companies, including Burlington Industries and Telex. Over time, though, Cohen began to lose confidence in Good. The sale of junk bonds is normally among the most profitable aspects of merchant banking, but because Good's raiders rarely bought anything, Shearson's junk bond department sat idle, atrophying. When Asher Edelman finally managed to snag a company, the steakhouse chain Ponderosa, Shearson's junk bond offering was a disaster, and the firm took steep losses. Cohen steamed. Good took the blame. The final run of Shearson's Raider Express began on Black Monday, October 19, 1987. As the market crashed, scores of pending takeovers unraveled, and Cohen and Scheinberg panicked. For the first time, they realized that the firm could actually lose the hundreds of millions of dollars it was lending. When a buoyant Dan Good appeared before the investment committee a week later seeking approval for a Bilzerian raid on Singer, the former sewing machine maker, he received a rude shock. Instead of the $100 million down payment he had expected, Cohen demanded Bilzerian put up $250 million. "If he can't come up with it, fuck him," Scheinberg said. "I don't give a shit. The rules of the game have changed." No one was more shocked than Cohen when Bilzerian came up with the money, dragging Shearson, kicking and screaming, into its last great corporate raid. When Singer quickly capitulated, Bilzerian was forced for the first time to raise the money to buy a company, not an easy task given Wall Street's post-crash sobriety. It was a long, uphill fight, and before it ended, Scheinberg and Good nearly came to blows. At one point, Good fled New York for a Caribbean vacation, and Scheinberg brought in his sworn enemy, Tom Hill, to bargain with Bilzerian. With what one imagines must have been unparalleled glee, Hill began to play hardball with Good's best client. When the deal started falling apart, Hill would later boast, "I had to come in and break Bilzerian's legs." Eventually, Bilzerian acquired Singer, but the deal was Good's Waterloo. Although Singer generated well over $30 million in fees, he had lost all credibility within the firm. Good already had two guns at his head, Hill recalled, and then Peter Solomon put one in his mouth. Solomon, formerly Good's superior as co-head of investment banking, was a boisterous, bullying Lehman veteran who coveted Good's domain as a way to exert control over the latest evolution in Shearson's merchant banking drive, an LBO fund. Cohen's long-overdue decision to raise a fund was a reaction to competitors' success with similar funds and to Black Monday. Investing other people's money, any fool could see, was far safer than investing one's own. Cohen and Solomon, however, had wholly different visions of the fund, which was to raise more than $1 billion. At other firms, LBO funds are semi-autonomous, but friends say the ambitious Solomon saw Shearson's as a chance to establish a personal fiefdom and get rich at the same time. He sought to claim a sizable piece of the fund's profits, something to which Cohen was staunchly opposed. Cohen regarded the fund as just another Shearson department and couldn't see why Solomon should receive a special deal. Both men were headstrong and temperamental, and by the spring of 1988, they were barely speaking. Bob Millard, Shearson's suave head of arbitrage trading, became the reluctant conduit through which they communicated. It was hardly an auspicious start for Shearson's drive into LBOs. With Solomon and Cohen at loggerheads, Tom Hill was riding to his greatest glory. 4 days before Steve Waters' resignation that March, Hill unveiled his flashiest takeover attempt yet, a $1.27 billion hostile tender offer by a British firm, Beazer plc, for a sleepy Pittsburgh company named Coppers Company. But this particular deal had a twist. Shearson owned 45% of the acquisition vehicle, Beazer just less than half. Never before had a major investment bank taken a high-profile position in a hostile takeover vehicle. Shearson was stepping over an invisible line, and Hill was practically giddy at the prospects the innovative deal might have for his business and, presumably, his reputation. He was convinced the deal would be an easy victory, a slam dunk in Wall Street parlance. He couldn't have been more wrong. Coppers's defense became a cause célèbre in Pittsburgh. Shearson and American Express were publicly attacked by everyone from Pittsburgh's mayor to the Pennsylvania state treasurer, who cut off all state business with both firms. Copper's employees posed for pictures cutting their American Express cards in half and sent letters to other companies denouncing American Express's support for the bid. No one was angrier than Jim Robinson, who felt he hadn't been adequately consulted about the move. It created a lot of heat for Jim Robinson, and heat from Jim Robinson shoots through from the 51st floor to the 19th floor pretty fast, said a Cohen confidant. It was a painful experience for Peter. Although its client ultimately won the battle, the Coppers deal had a profound effect on Shearson's merchant banking effort. Suddenly, hostile deals, the backbone of its recent successes, were badly out of favor. That summer, Cohen turned down the chance to back a pair of hostile takeover attempts, the Rails Brothers' raid on St. Louis-based Interco and underwear magnate Bill Farley's run at a Georgia textile concern, West Point Pepperell. At the same time, Shearson's earnings began to sag. The entire securities industry suffered in Black Monday's wake, but few firms more so than Shearson, which had dramatically increased its overhead by acquiring a faltering brokerage, E.F. Hutton. Although there had been layoffs, and Cohen planned more, he badly needed a fresh stream of profits. Merchant banking had become Wall Street's most active and profitable business. Now, more than ever, it was critical that Shearson plunge into it. And, with hostile deals all but ruled out, that meant one thing: LBOs. When Russ Johnson switched course and began contemplating LBO scenarios, it looked like the answer to Cohen's prayers. An $18 billion buyout could wash away a lot of problems. The mere fact they had carried it off, the largest LBO in history, would instantly catapult Shearson into the top ranks of merchant banking firms. Afterward, anyone considering a major LBO would have to consider working with Shearson. It would be a magnificent debut for the fund. The residual benefits for Hill's merger business would be tremendous. The bonds Shearson would sell to finance the deal could, in one fell swoop, revive Cohen's moribund junk bond department. And all before they took a single fee. Oh, the fees. The upfront fees alone, for advising and money lending, and a success fee, maybe $200 million in all, would be a gigantic boost to Shearson's flagging earnings. And it wouldn't stop there. For years afterward, the money would continue to stream in. There would be fees for refinancing, fees for advice, and fees for simply minding the shop. M&A alone could count on tens of millions in fees from the divestitures they planned as RJR Nabisco's unwanted businesses were chopped up and sold to meet debt payments. And all before they even thought about returns on their investment. Hill was projecting an annual return of at least 40%. On a $500 million investment, that was $200 million a year for 5 years or more. It was enough to make Cohen's head swim. Even though he had masterminded Shearson's own acquisitions, Cohen had worked on only one LBO in his entire career, Scheller Globe, which, until RJR Nabisco, remained Shearson's largest. But Johnson's friendship with Jim Robinson, combined with the deal's potential impact on Shearson, compelled him to take an active interest in the current deliberations. Johnson was dangling before his eyes a dream deal, quite literally the deal of a lifetime. And as his plane touched down in Atlanta that evening, it was all within Peter Cohen's grasp. Saturday morning, Cohen had breakfast at the Waverly with Tom Hill and Jack Nussbaum, Shearson's lead attorney. One of Cohen's closest advisers, Nussbaum, a commonsensical counsel with the face of an angst-ridden bulldog, had learned of the brewing deal while on vacation in Morocco. He had flown to Atlanta 2 days early to hear a presentation on tobacco liability from Ed Horrigan and Harold Henderson, and came away convinced the legal quandary wasn't bad enough to prevent an LBO. Hill and a veteran Shearson banker named Jim Stern went down a day early, laying the groundwork for Saturday's meeting and letting Johnson's people know what to expect if they went forward. So far, so good, both men agreed. Johnson seemed to be on track. After breakfast, the Shearson team shuttled across the parking lot to headquarters in 2s and 3s to avoid arousing suspicion. Upstairs, they settled into Johnson's office overlooking a sea of Georgia pines. Johnson, accompanied by Horrigan, Sage, and Henderson, had brought along the newest member of his team, Stephen Goldstone, of the Wall Street firm of Davis, Polk, and Wardwell. At 42, Goldstone was a curious choice to advise the RJR Nabisco executives. Slight and balding, the New York-raised son of a lingerie merchant, he was a rarity among Wall Street lawyers. Most specialized in advising merger clients or litigating court cases, but Goldstone did both. As a tactician, he was virtually unknown. For a decade, he worked on the bread-and-butter underwriting and mid-size acquisitions on which the securities industry is built. He had met Johnson when Davis Polk helped install RJR Nabisco's poison pill that summer. As a litigator, Goldstone had gained notoriety for his role in what American Lawyer called the most talked-about district court ruling of 1987. Defending the Wall Street firm Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette in a San Diego lawsuit, Goldstone inexplicably defied a court order to produce a key witness, prompting the judge to declare a default judgment against his client, a move that left Donaldson Lufkin vulnerable to a $100 million loss. Adding insult to injury, claims against 3 co-defendants were thrown out 4 months later. Hiring Goldstone had been Henderson's idea. From the outset, it was clear this would be no ordinary LBO. The talk in Johnson's office that day was cordial and covered a variety of issues: price, profits, and plans of attack, among other things. Until then, their discussions had been largely theoretical and over the phone. No one was sure Johnson would actually go through with it. "What do you think the chances are he'll do it?" Nussbaum asked Goldstone at one point. Goldstone pondered the question a moment. "Less than 50-50, he said. For all their uncertainty, Tom Hill was surprised to find how thoroughly Johnson's people understood LBOs. The people, in fact, was about to tell the teacher how class would be run. Central to the success of most LBOs is a ruse known as the gun-to-the-head strategy. In it, a group of senior corporate executives secretly works with a Wall Street firm such as Shearson to assemble financing. Once the financing is lined up and an offering price agreed on, the chief executive presents the bid as a take-it-or-leave-it proposition to his board. Hill had even drawn up a 10-week schedule the Johnson-Shearson Group could follow in approaching its own buyout. It might have been called 10 Steps to a Successful LBO. Weeks 1 through 3. Preliminary work on values and price discussions. Week 4. Meet with banks to discuss loans. Week 5. Banks work to refine a loan structure. Week 6. Management decides whether to pursue LBO. Week 7. Directors are quietly informed and asked to secretly form an independent committee to analyze any LBO proposal. Week 8. Management prepares a merger agreement. Week 9. Management makes an initial proposal to the board. Negotiations begin with the independent committee. A press release is issued stating the board is considering a buyout proposal. Week 10. An acquisition agreement is executed and announced publicly. The idea is to keep the entire process secret until a deal has been cut, ending the bidding before it can begin. Placing a gun to the board's head, in Wall Street parlance, is intended to leave directors with few options. Disclosing the overture prematurely tends to put the company in play for corporate raiders and risks frightening off a certain offer from management. For years, boards capitulated and signed merger agreements with the ambushing management. Many still did. Wall Street strategists such as Hill consider it crucial to sneak up on a board with a fully financed offer ready to be launched. He naturally assumed Johnson felt the same way. Johnson wouldn't hear of it. He had seen this board exact its wrath on Tylee Wilson for lesser transgressions. Hell hath no fury like this board scorned. Nor was he willing to let Shearson arrange financing or do anything else that, if leaked, would anger directors. Johnson had it good in Atlanta, and until he made up his mind to pursue the LBO, he wasn't going to risk it all by letting Shearson get ahead of him. On the other hand, Johnson had supreme faith in his ability to make a pitch. If an LBO was the best approach, he knew he could sell it to the board, but only if it was an idea, not an ambush. Diverting from accepted LBO strategy made Cohen and Hill uneasy, but they had no choice. Without Johnson, they had no deal. If the board chose to publicly announce their overture, it would blow their tactical advantage. In a worst-case scenario, it would put them on equal footing with any party who might wish to top their bid. But no one, Cohen, Hill, or Johnson, was particularly worried about that happening. RJR Nabisco was simply too big for all but a handful of firms in the world to think about attacking. That day, Hill ran down the possibilities. Hanson Trust plc, a British conglomerate with a huge appetite for U.S. companies. Its chairman, Lord Hanson, had built its empire around a core tobacco company. American Brands, the Connecticut-based cigarette company, whose brands included Pall Mall and Lucky Strike, had pulled off a daring defense against a hostile takeover raid earlier that year. Forstmann Little, Wall Street's number 2 LBO firm, had shown itself willing to charge into heated takeover battles with multi-billion-dollar offers, but a $20 billion LBO, Hill suggested, was probably out of Forstmann Little's reach. All were dark horses. Everyone in the room knew the only one strong enough to put up real competition was Henry Kravis. Of all the world's conglomerates and investors, only Kravis had the combination of power, confidence, and money to mount a serious counterbid. Johnson's office was filled with opinions and purported intelligence. Someone mentioned they thought Kravis was on an African safari and might not be able to react fast enough. But it was when Johnson talked that Shearson Lehman Hutton listened. They all knew Kravis had courted him a year earlier. "Henry won't do anything," Johnson said confidently. "I just don't think he's interested in tobacco." Andy Sage echoed his boss's feelings. It was a critical assertion, one that Johnson repeated several times in coming days. He knew of Kravis's overtures via Beck and Waters and didn't take them at all seriously. He purposely avoided mentioning them to Shearson. "No reason to," Johnson would later say. "They'd have just run around in a flap saying, 'We've got to do this and we've got to do that.' These are not cool people in this business. I didn't want them to lose any objectivity." In fact, Johnson was lulled by the same fundamental fallacy embraced by the Shearson executives. For all the talk of possible competitors, most of them were convinced their bid, if launched, would be unopposed. They felt certain that no one, not even Kravis, would attempt a buyout this size without the help of a management team to identify the best ways to cut costs. Even if tempted, they believed, Kravis would no doubt be put off by the daunting complexities of tobacco litigation. Cohen and Hill, in effect, considered Johnson to be their shield against any competing bids. As the group's primary strategist, Hill had ways to test Kravis's appetite, but later said he felt handcuffed by Johnson's insistence on secrecy. Asking questions, he knew, could prompt interest in the wrong quarters. Just as Shearson took it on faith that Johnson could handle his board, Johnson took it on faith that Shearson could raise enough money to buy the company. In fact, the firm had never attempted anything like it, and had even discussed the possibility of bringing in a major junk bond power such as Drexel or Merrill Lynch to help out. The idea was quickly dropped. Seeking help would be an admission that Shearson couldn't do the deal itself. Cohen was confident that, with American Express behind it, Shearson could do the job. Price was never a matter of serious debate. Both Hill and Johnson thought a bid around $75 a share made sense. It was higher than the stock had ever traded, around $71, although not by much. The $75 a share worked out to $17.6 billion, nearly 3 times the size of the Beatrice deal. The $15 billion or so they would need from commercial banks was more than twice the largest sum ever lent on a takeover. Shearson's Jim Stern had spent hours calculating whether that much takeover money existed in the world. $17 billion, Johnson said. Fuck, I'll be going around on my hands and knees like a monkey with an organ grinder to find $17 billion. It could go higher, Hill warned. The board would try and negotiate a better price, perhaps as high as the low $80 range. It was all part of the elaborate stage play performed in most LBO situations. A management group bid low on purpose, knowing the board would want to coax a few dollars more. The ruse allowed directors to claim they had pushed for the best price. It was good public relations, but was even more useful in defending directors against the inevitable shareholder lawsuit. Johnson got visibly queasy when talk turned to paying more than $75. The higher the price, the more debt had to be piled on. The more debt, the more the corporate belt had to be tightened. Johnson was a man with absolutely no stomach for cost-cutting, certainly not if it meant cutting back the RJR Air Force or other perks. He felt Shearson, like most lenders, was obsessed with what he called nits and grunts budget watching. Johnson insisted that, if the LBO went forward, both Premier and the Atlanta headquarters be held sacrosanct from any budget cutting. "I'm telling you, we're not going to start running a push-cart operation here," Johnson declared. "I don't want a bunch of your guys coming around saying we should have 5 jets instead of 6, that sort of thing. I realize if we do this, I'll have to work my ass off a while. I don't mind that. But I don't want my lifestyle to change. I've got a great company, a nice life. I don't want to change the way I live." A more seasoned LBO player might have laughed at the idea of a painless LBO. Cohen and Hill went along, although privately Hill felt certain that both Premier and the headquarters would ultimately be sacrificed. Both men were bent on making the process of an LBO as easy for Johnson as possible. Nothing would be done to spook their prize stallion from charging out of the gate at the board gathering the evening of October 19th, just 10 days hence. They readily acceded to each of Johnson's demands. The future of Shearson's LBO effort depended on keeping him happy. Steve Goldstone, hired to protect Johnson's interests, sensed that Shearson might be painting an overly rosy picture for his client. "Look," he told Nussbaum at one point, "are you guys telling Ross that he is going to have to pay top dollar here, and that he will have to make a competitive bid?" Both Nussbaum and Hill swore they were telling it straight. The last and most important point of discussion that day was a management agreement. As the central document defining Johnson's relationship to Shearson, it would lay out how RJR Nabisco would be run, who would control it, and how the profits would be split. Within the LBO community, executives who throw in their lots with the likes of Henry Kravis have clearly defined roles. As leaders of publicly held companies, they were ardently wooed by LBO firms. A Kohlberg-Kravis can knock on the door, but in most cases it can't get in without being invited. In return, LBO firms typically permit them to put up their own money to buy 10 to 15% stakes in the companies they previously ran as professional managers. But while the CEO remains nominal head and often retains operating autonomy, there is no mistaking who calls the shots. Firms such as Kohlberg-Kravis and Forsman Little control every board, approve every budget, and retain the power to remove senior executives at their whim. LBOs are not democracies. Each executive in a Kohlberg-Kravis-owned company answers to Kravis and Roberts. Johnson didn't care much for conventional wisdom. What he had in mind amounted to nothing less than a total reversal of the traditional roles of the executive and the LBO firm. Why, Johnson wondered, should Shearson control the board? After all, wasn't he the one putting his job on the line? Why shouldn't the managers, the men who knew this company best, call the shots? To Shearson's amazement, he had demanded control of the board and a veto over major strategic decisions, both during and after the deal. He suspected correctly that Shearson would want to cut Premier, the headquarters, and the RJR Air Force. A veto was his insurance RJR Nabisco would be run his way, not Shearson's. For Christ's sake, I'm not going to have a bunch of bloody investment bankers on my board telling me what I can do and what I can't do, he told Cohen. You've got to have faith that I know how to do it. I don't need a bunch of kids looking at screens all day trying to figure it out for me. That's the way it's got to be if I'm going through all this horse shit and put myself through 5 more goddamn years of agony instead of retiring. Henry Kravis would have told Johnson to jump in a lake. But Cohen and Hill had already made up their minds to concede to his demand. Again, they felt they had no choice. Johnson made it clear. No veto, no deal. It was, Hill would later acknowledge, the price of admission to a club Shearson badly wanted to join. But Cohen had so far balked at Johnson's most outrageous demand. Andy Sage had determined that Shearson had promised the investors in its new fund a 40% return on their money. Fine, Sage said, Shearson could have 40%. He insisted Johnson and his people receive everything left over. That worked out to 20% or more of the stock in a post-LBO RJR Nabisco. Without arguing, Hill had let Sage know he considered the request excessive. As evidence, he had brought to Atlanta a sheaf of management agreements from other LBOs. In Beatrice, for example, Kelly and his people had bought a 12.5% share. But Johnson not only wanted a far larger percentage of the profits, he wanted it on a far larger deal. Hill had calculated a 20% share of the profits could be worth $2.5 billion to Johnson's group in 5 years. In a September 30th memo to Cohen, Jim Stern had noted that Johnson's suggested cut, or promote, seems very large, particularly when one considers the size of this deal compared with previous ones. In absolute terms, the level of management's promote dwarfs those in other deals. The matter was discussed again Saturday. But when the group adjourned around 3 o'clock, little headway had been made. So much progress had been gained on other fronts, it hardly seemed necessary to muddy the waters with a lengthy negotiation. Johnson assured Cohen the question of splitting the profits wouldn't be a problem, and Cohen, thrilled with their progress, felt certain he was right. Sage agreed to discuss it with Hill the following week. Before returning to New York, the Shearson bankers tried once again to persuade Johnson to sit down with a group of commercial banks to discuss financing. Johnson refused. Shearson, he said, could approach only 2 banks, and then only for preliminary discussions. Find out if there's enough money to do this deal, Johnson told Cohen, and limit it to that. They would have plenty of time to negotiate bank agreements in the weeks to come. Monday was Columbus Day. Cohen reached Charles Sanford, chairman of Bankers Trust, at his home. Charlie, I have to talk to you about something that is of great importance to both of us. The sooner we can do this, the better. Once we talk about it, you'll understand why we can't do this on the phone. Cohen reached Citibank's chairman, John Reed, the next day. John, I've got a tremendous opportunity for you. The following morning, Wednesday, October 12th, a Shearson team, led by Jim Stern, met separately with senior representatives of Bankers Trust and Citibank. To ensure secrecy, Stern demanded that both banks limit their credit analysis teams to no more than 4 bankers. Within 2 days, he heard back that both were ready to commit to the transaction. This was going to be easier than anyone had hoped, Stern thought. Bob O'Brien, the head of takeover lending for Bankers Trust in New York, found analyzing Shearson's proposal among the most fascinating exercises of his career. There was no question that any bank would jump at the opportunity to lend money for the LBO of a blue-chip company like RJR Nabisco. The central dilemma was this: was there, as Jim Stern had already wondered, enough takeover money in the world to do it? In most large takeovers, loans are parceled out or syndicated to banks around the globe. O'Brien's team canvassed each of his department's 50 or so salespeople worldwide. Country by country, bank by bank, they totted up the dollars available for LBOs. The lending practices of banks in Ireland, Belgium, Denmark, and Greece were assessed. How would the Union Bank of Finland react to the buyout of an Atlanta conglomerate? How would the unpredictable Japanese banks feel about tobacco? In the end, O'Brien concluded there was a total of $21 billion worldwide that could be committed to a single buyout. From there, he worked down. Not all the money, of course, would come. Some banks won't like tobacco, he reasoned, because the chairman had smoke blown in his face one day. Of the $21 billion, O'Brien was willing to bet he could put his hands on $16 billion. It was an aggressive guess. In its calculations, Shearson penciled in $15.5 billion, roughly 3/4 of all the LBO money in the world. For a man whose life had been one long party, there was a curious lack of merriment about Johnson in the days leading up to October 19th. Andy Sage was struck by the fact he wasn't getting the buoyant late-night calls from Johnson that had accompanied all their previous adventures. It struck more than a few amateur psychologists that Johnson might be doing the whole thing to fill the void caused by his son's accident. Bruce Johnson remained in a coma. As the board meeting approached, Johnson seemed to grow ambivalent toward the whole idea of an LBO. Part of it, of course, was that so many of Johnson's longtime pals wouldn't be taking the trip with him. In a long, teary dinner, Johnson told Bob Carbonell he wouldn't be part of the 7-man group making the bid. If they won, Del Monte was to be sold. Of those included, Ed Horrigan was the most enthusiastic. According to Johnson and others, Horrigan was positively giddy at the prospect of LBO riches. He scurried about, working and reworking a list of those to be included in the group on a yellow legal pad. If Johnson was salivating over the millions he stood to make, no one saw it, nor did he seem concerned by the inherent conflict of interest faced by executives engaged in LBOs. To Johnson, buying the company wasn't a conflict of interest, but a wondrous convergence of interests. In an LBO, he believed, everyone would win. The stock problem would be solved. Stockholders would get a $75 payout. We wouldn't hit that level for 4 or 5 years running the company the way it was, he said, as if 4 or 5 years were an eternity. Shearson and his friend Jim Robinson would get a great feather in their caps, and Johnson and his friends would get rich beyond their wildest dreams. Monday morning quarterbacks would attribute Johnson's decision to proceed to greed, but it was more complicated than that. First and foremost, the LBO seemed to satisfy Johnson's cravings for action. He wasn't letting this organization decay. If his justification, the stock problem, was overblown, Johnson had shown himself incapable of ignoring a dilemma other CEOs would dismiss as minor. And while Johnson liked the prospect of an instant fortune as much as any man, he loved giving as well as receiving. This would be the ultimate gift to everyone. Ross, his psychologist friend O.C. Adams observed, created a situation where he thought there was a chicken in every pot. On Thursday, October 13th, Johnson tracked down Charlie Hugel at a hotel in Seoul, South Korea, where Hugel was peddling nuclear plants. Terrified someone would overhear the conversation on an unreliable overseas connection, Johnson tried to talk in a sort of code. "You remember the project we were looking at?" he asked. Yes, Hugel said. He thought he had talked Johnson out of pursuing an LBO a month before. Well, Charlie, it's beginning to look the other way. There may be a lot more meat to this thing than when I talked to you before. It's something the board has to look at. Hugel was stunned. We're going to go for it, Johnson said. It's important that you get back and be there for this meeting. Hugel searched his mind for something to explain Johnson's turnabout. Bruce's accident, maybe? He began to try and talk Johnson out of it, but stopped. The distance, combined with Johnson's resolve, sealed his lips. Before hanging up, Johnson asked if Hugel would head the independent committee that would evaluate his offer. Hugel accepted. Johnson had assured Cohen that negotiating the management agreement would be no trouble, but Andy Sage had his own ideas. He was no fool. If Shearson wanted to do this deal, it would do it by Johnson's rules. The Saturday session had already demonstrated that. Now Sage was prepared to drive that message home by taking a hard line on Johnson's cut of the profits. Andy, Steve Goldstone said at one point, Shearson will never agree to this stuff. Look, Sage replied, it's already been agreed to in principle. I'm telling you, Goldstone warned, they won't agree to it. They'd be giving away way too much. Sage was adamant. I'm telling you, this is the deal. They'll take it. Tom Hill and Jim Stern walked into Sage's ambush at RJR Nabisco's Manhattan offices Thursday morning. From the first words, the meeting was to be drastically different in tone than the gathering in Atlanta. Gone was the good old boy, putting green folksiness of Ross Johnson. In his place was an icy, bullying Andy Sage. In the dramatic setting of RJR Nabisco's glass-walled New York boardroom, the Shearson bankers listened as Sage laid down the law. If Shearson wanted Johnson to go forward, Shearson would have only 2 of 7 board seats. Johnson would take 3, with the remainder going to a pair of independent directors. Johnson's executives would put up no